Very big welcome to everybody here. As Hannah kindly said, so my name's Sam. I'm part of the preaching team here at Sutton Vineyard. So I was going to say we have quite a lot of people out at the moment, which we do. It being the summer holiday, it being August bank holiday, but it looks like we've got a good number of people. So a special welcome to those that are visiting. And as Hannah said, so this morning we're carrying on our series called Created to Create that we've run through kind of July and August. But before we start, why don't I pray? Lord, as David sung in his psalm, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. And this morning we praise your name as we meet and give thanks. And for those on holiday, we pray that it's a time of joy and rest. And for those that are at Christian camps that got very wet yesterday and slightly flooded, we pray for them and that they get home without trench foot. Amen. Also, a massive congratulations for those that picked up any exam results this week. We know a few people that absolutely smashed it, so well done. But like I said, so this morning we're looking at our series, which is looking at the creation story in Genesis and that beautiful and awe-inspiring poetic text that we've been running through. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've been a little bit hesitant of this series. So this morning we're looking at Genesis 1 verses 20 to 23, and the title is Exploration and Imagination, and it's all about being creative. And a little confession, I was slightly hesitant when it came into this series, and I think I've noticed everyone that's preached in this so far has stood up and said the same thing, that they've professed to not being creative. And in fact, maybe I've even been a little suspicious about imagination in the past. If you ask my wife, I can generally tend to be quite logical, quite matter of fact, and it seems to be that imagination can sometimes be contrary to that. Maybe it's I see it as more like something that children do. It's make-believe, it's playing, it's imaginary friends. But then when I've started to really reflect on this and started to work through, and I shouldn't be surprised that it happens, but so much has been kind of revealed and I've really reflected on, and the imagination, as I've looked at it, has started to become something so fundamental to how we live and how we operate, how we form friendships and relationships. And in fact, I've even got to this stage where I feel like to be human is to have imagination. And dare I say, as a philosopher, I imagine, therefore I am. A lot of our minds work in different ways. So I'm not here to say we all think in the same way and our imaginations work in the same way. But everyone does have room to create, with the ability to bring things to their minds of new ideas or concepts, of external objects not necessarily present. And that's what we talk about when we're referring to the imagination. And it's very much human nature. It's built into our nature to be creative. We wouldn't be here and operating in the way that we do if we weren't. So if you've got a Bible, I invite you to turn to Genesis 1. It's very strategically at the beginning of the Bible, albeit you've probably got a number of maps and interactive things before it. But Genesis 1 verses 20 to 23. And the words will come up behind me. This version is the ESV version, so maybe slightly different to the one that you have. But it reads, "And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. So the next part of my sermon, I've kind of titled to myself, The Ultimate Creator, which I think goes some way of kind of summarizing what we're looking at here. And so far in the series, we've seen the Lord create and order the world. He's created the land and the sea and vegetation and the sun and the moon, and we've spoken about nights and days. And today we read about the Lord bringing into being creatures. And what I think is obvious in when you read the creation story is how much can be contained in so little. And I counted, because that's what I do, that there are 29 English words here in my translation, obviously translated from the original. And we read that God created every living creature in the sea and every bird in the sky. To really think about how much can be contained in so little. Now, I know exactly how that looked. The day of creation is something that is unknown to us. But we can have a look around us at the sheer size and grandeur of what that actually entails, and the actual scale of God creating every fish and bird. And the fact that this creation was ever moving, he said, multiply, and it gets bigger and bigger. So I had a look. Again, a little bit of a fact man, not necessarily imaginative. I like logic. But did you know the best estimate there is around 50 to 430 billion birds in the earth on Earth currently, or 11,000 species. And there are even more. There are estimated 3.5 trillion fish estimated in our seas, rivers and seas, and that's around about 34,000 species. And we read in 5 words that God created the sea creatures, and sometimes the magnitude naturally can get lost on us. And pun very much intended here, but that's actually small fry. Astronomers estimate that the universe could contain, I need to read this number, 1 septillion stars. And for those that don't know, that's a 1 followed by 24 zeros. So I was going to put it on the screen, but actually, size-wise, it would have been a bit tricky. And our Milky Way alone contains more than 100 billion stars, including our sun. And it's difficult for our minds to fathom the size of those numbers at times. And actually, studies have been said that once you get past a certain amount, the mind stops trying to consider it. It just becomes another number, and you just know bigger. So you go from 1 million to 1 billion, and you just kind of know bigger. The actual concept of considering that is slightly lost in us. So I'm going to try and bring that a little bit to home. So we've got an exercise this morning. A really massive thank you to our PA team that's helped set this up. But I brought a clock, and it has a second hand on it. So if we can turn up the microphone so that we can hear that. So we've got a clock ticking. Together we're going to count to 5 if everyone could join with me. There's a few Christians in the room, so we might be offbeat, but let's try and see if we can get it right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. If we counted 1 million seconds, we would be here for 11.6 days. So that's not too bad. Here for Paul's sermon next week. A little bit of a break before we then have Judy and Libby talking to us about the next series and vision. If we counted 1 billion seconds, does anyone know how long we would be here? Thank you, Tim. 1 million seconds, 11.6 days. 1 billion seconds, 31.7 years. If we counted every bird in the sky, let's just say there's 50 billion of them, so the lower estimate, we'd be here 1,587 years. Stars in the solar system, we would be here over 3,000 years. And if we counted all the fish, one every second, we would be here around 111,000 years. I couldn't do the math on the septillion stars in the universe because no one ever actually writes it down. They do it to the powers, and my mind starts to go a little bit numb. And then equally, the number of years that we would be here counting that would equally be a number that we'd have to try and explain. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for all the effort to do that, by the way. So, fun story short, the Lord didn't create in half measures. In my introduction, I referred to the Lord being the ultimate creator, which I think may be underestimated or an underestimation. The Lord spoke into a being, a creation so grand, our tiny little minds cannot comprehend. And he said to have known every star by name. Lord is the ultimate creator with the ultimate imagination. He conceived this universe and then he intentionally spoke it into being. And that is what we're talking about when we speak about the imagination this morning. It's the ability of forming new ideas or concepts of external objects not present to the senses, to bring forth ideas and concepts of things that aren't there. And I don't want to get buried in the logic too much, but God conceived this and he spoke it into being. And it wasn't a point in time thing. The incredible nature of the Lord's creation is it's ever moving and it's ever growing. They actually say the universe is expanding out continually. We are obviously in continual movement. We know that birds and creatures evolve and develop. In the very text that we read, God commands them to multiply. And one of the things that's really intriguing, I was reflecting this morning, is you can never divide creation from the creator. Despite everything has a creator, and to think of the two completely separate is illogical. And as humans, we're fascinated just as much by the creations as we are who created them. And that's a good thing. In 1903, a Spanish archaeologist found cave paintings in northern Spain. And they're not famous because they're the best artwork in the world. I was going to make the joke, they're depictions of animals. I was going to make the joke that I could probably do better with crowns, and then I realized I very much couldn't because I'm not that way inclined. But we're not amazed by the cave paintings because of how incredible the artwork is. It's what they tell us about who created them. Who were they? When were they around? Why did they create? And it's the same when we think about the Lord's creation and when we look at the earth. The study of what creation tells us about the nature of God is the theology of creation. We've spoken about it in part through this series, and we could speak on it continually all year and then some. But one of the things that's absolutely amazing is we talk about the fact that creation sings, it represents the Lord's glory. It declares the glory of the Lord. And we read in Psalm 19, verse 1, I think we've got the words behind, but the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. And that's true of all creations. It speaks of the Creator. And one thing that's really very clear is that we are in the Lord's creation and we are invited to see the Lord through it, to discover his greatness, to get close to him through his wondrous creation. And actually, one of the things I was really reflecting on is just one simple thing that the creation kind of shows me. And one part of that was the Lord didn't create a holding pen for us for a short period of time. It wouldn't. I don't feel like it would look like this if it was only ever designed to be a limiting, humans are on earth for 70, 80, 90 years, however long we live, and to be in it is simply to hold us until the next life that we talk to. We can't even contemplate a septillion number of stars, let alone appreciate that size and the wondrous world that we live in. And clearly God's created something that's more than just a holding pen. It's something to explore, and we are invited to do that. So point number one. So God is the ultimate creator who's spoken into being something we cannot comprehend at times. Certainly something that inspires us. And its very existence sings of the greatness and his ultimate imagination to conceive of this world. Its creation, our place in it, speaks of the intention of the Lord for us to live fully. And I feel like it echoes the words that we read in John's gospel when it said that Jesus came that we may have life and have it abundantly. It talks about abundance. And actually that life for us is to know and to be close to the Lord. And we're invited to do that in and through his creation. But what does this mean? What does this mean for us? And what does this mean for our creativity? So first things first, we read in Genesis that we were made in God's image. God proclaimed that he would make us in our image. This is the Trinity, so in our image after our likeness. We're going to hear a bit more about this next week as we get to that part of Genesis, and we've got Paul's sermon to look forward to. But we were made in God's image. And when we consider God's ability to create and imagine, we have a similar faculty. And I don't think it's something that should be downplayed, and it's easily thrown away to say, I'm not a creative person. I've certainly done that. Now, unlike the Lord, what we do is limited by his creation. Now, what do I mean by that? So there's a phrase that there are no original thoughts. And it's a bit of a throwaway phrase, but it's absolutely true. It's something that we reflect on. There are no original thoughts. In fact, everything we think has to be based in creation. So if I was to ask the room to think about a new creature, what often happens is you start to think about things like an eagle with a lion's head on it. Actually, someone's already created that one. But you go through, and what you start to realize is you start plugging different animal parts onto different animals, like a guinea pig's head on a giraffe's body, which is hilarious. And it's the same with everything. If I was to paint or if I was to write, there isn't anything of a brand new concept I could bring up. It's borrowing inspiration from the world we live in. And as I was reflecting on this, there was this beautiful image to think that everything we create is indistinguishable from the Lord's creation that we're part of. There isn't anything new. That's the difference between the Lord, who could bring everything out of nothing, and us who create in that creation. But one thing that I think is it's extremely easy to underestimate the importance of imagination. And I think what we often say is, if we say the phrase, that's just in their imagination, that's just in their heads. It's like, yes, that's quite a lot of the world that we live in, and we'll get to that a little bit later. It's fundamental to how we think and how we interact. Our minds have lots of abilities. We've got things like memory, we've got things like emotion, we've got senses that perceive the earth around us, or maybe we have things like triggers like hunger or thirst. But the imagination has a significant part in stitching all of those together. So unlike seeing or perceiving someone closing a door, the imagination is not dependent on external sensory information from what we see, hear, feel, taste, or touch. So if I have a physical urge, or if someone has a physical urge this morning of hunger, okay, yeah, that's hunger. It's a trigger. It's the imagination that turns around and thinks, oh, what could I eat? And brings to the mind the things that we could think about. Maybe it's the imagination that maybe it's the memory that remembers the box of chocolates that went round earlier and taking maybe a twirl about 15 minutes ago. But it's my imagination that starts to think, why did I just take a twirl? Why not a crunchy as well? It's the imagination that starts to picture the biscuits that are outside and which ones we're going to take. We start to realize that the imagination is used a lot more of our interactions than we may originally think. Humans use their imagination to acquire knowledge about the world, to better understand another person's perception, to solve problems, to create and interact, to understand artwork that's around us. So one of my examples this morning, so what happens if I go through that door? So I think I know. I think I go through that door and I'm in kind of a little hallway or an atrium, and then I'm faced with a fire exit door which has got a push to open, and then I could walk out there and I could walk around the corner into the car park and go past the bike sheds and maybe get out onto the road. And I know that because I've actually done that on quite a number of occasions, and my memory is part of that. But it's my imagination that stitches it together, that can picture myself walking through it. And what we start to realize is the imagination, which we see going hand in hand with creativity, it powers our free will. That's maybe a bit of a heavy point, but what do I mean by that? So what do I mean by the imagination powers free will? Well, I've got the freedom to carry on standing on this stage and continuing to deliver a sermon, or I could jump down, walk out those doors, walk down the road. My imagination can consider what that option looks like. First of all, I can imagine what the route looks like, as I said. I can imagine the response from JD as I start to steal the microphone from church. I can imagine the response from Judy and Libby when they find out that halfway through my sermon I jumped down off the stage and just left. My imagination presents the options to me, and obviously my free will decides which one I go for. To have free will is to have the options, and our imaginations present these options to us. And this will happen constantly to all of us, virtually 24/7. And so much of it we actually take for granted. We probably underestimate actually how much we are creating and how much we're doing on a day-to-day basis. To be free is to conceive, to imagine the options you have, to assess them, and then to make a decision. That is, and of itself, an aspect of creativity. And what's more, do you know what else imagination is absolutely fundamental to? And that's relationships. We talk about building friendships or making connections and creating those things. And sometimes maybe that can be perceived as a little bit of a play on words when we're talking about the ability to create. But actually it's not. It's based on the fact that in order to create a friendship, you converse with someone. And that in and of itself is creative. It's imaginative. Do you know how much creativity it takes to have a conversation with a loved one? Try having a conversation with someone you don't know yet. You're constantly trying to think of what can the connections be between me and this person? How do I make that connection? When we make jokes, that is an aspect of creativity, and I can assure you as an extremely funny person myself that a lot of creative thought goes into jokes, and that's why it's so painful when no one laughs. So thank you for the pity laugh over here, where my relatives are. I was reading a paper about the importance of the imagination in empathy and how important empathy is for the relationships that we have around us. And empathy in and of itself is the aspect of being able to imagine the perspective of the other person in what we do and what we say and how we treat them. And that empathy is so critical to the relationships that we have. And in fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my relationships are in my imagination, which did make me laugh as I was writing it. But if I think about my beautiful wife, Sarah, so much of our relationship is in my imagination. And what do I mean by that? When I think about us having plans, I imagine what we're going to do later. I imagine how the evening's going to go. I imagine if we go out for a meal or drinks, where we're going to go to, what I'm going to order, how things will pan out. Longer term, I think about what our future looks like. I sometimes imagine what plans and dreams that we have. What are things going to be like in 20 years' time? And actually, some of the things that I'm anxious of and scared of are things that I bring through in my imagination, circumstances that I want to avoid. And I realize that actually my hopes and dreams, what we have, the plans that we have for each other are in the imagination. And that's not to say they don't exist. And that is, I think, a way that we use imagination certainly in the Western world that is quite counterintuitive, that we think of imagination being something that doesn't exist. My plans for me and Sarah and her plans for us, they certainly exist, but they're only in our imagination. So, God created us to create. That is the sermon, the series topic. And it's more than artwork or physical things that we may leave behind, music, dance, those sort of things. We've spoken about actually how broad creation can be. I love to cook, and there is so much creativity that kind of goes into that. But more than that, because I think we massively underplay it, that God created us to have free will, and to have the ability to have a relationship with him and to others. And all of that is built on creating and imagination and what we do with that. Nearly everything we do is exercising the creative power the Lord gave us. Our lives speak of what we've created. It speaks of that artwork. And just as creation can't be separated from the Creator, what we create in life echoes us, whether or not we like it or not. And one of the things that we read about is that we were made in God's likeness, his image. And what we're invited to every day is to consider whether or not what we are creating is in the Lord's image. Is it in the Lord's likeness? It takes creativity to compliment someone. It takes creativity to insult someone or come out with a barbed comment. At work, it takes creativity to foster an environment of support. And it takes creativity to foster an environment of conflict, whether or not we do it intentionally or not. It's really dawned on me that everything that I do is effectively my creation. So point 3, and just moving towards our conclusion. We've said this morning that the Lord is the ultimate creator. Point number 1. Point number 2, God created us to be free and relational. But what we do with that, what do we do with that life, what do we do with that creation is partly down to us. Once you appreciate that, you start to see that creativity comes through in what we do and say, the relationships that we build, the influence that we have on others. And what that means is it's important to question what we're doing with that creative power and how we're inviting God into it. First and foremost, God gave us free will to live our lives as we please and to have a relationship with him. And every single one of us is invited into that this morning. If we want our lives, which as Sarah and I were talking through, we kind of spoke about that being our canvas, something that we create. If we want that to reflect God, then we are invited into a relationship with him, and that is open to every single one of us. And then it talks about whether or not we are living life to the full with him, constantly in relationship with him, and how we reflect that. I was reading Matthew's Gospel in 22, and the greatest commandment is to love the Lord God with all your heart and soul and mind. And it's an extremely famous verse, I'm sure many of us can recall it. And then the next thing is to love others as yourself. And it's really important to reflect on whether or not our creative powers are living those commandments. Do we imagine a different life or circumstances or resent the one that we are in? Do we use the imagination for desires, to think of wants and needs, maybe to become obsessed with something we think will improve our lives? Pete has spoken in the past about that being the it, if people remember that sermon, something that we're continually striving for, that we've created in our minds that we think are going to solve all of our problems. And what that can lead to is resentment when we don't have it, and pain and bitterness when we eventually maybe do and realize that it hasn't solved anything. Our imagination are where our hopes live. It can also be where our resentments live. Imagination is often what heightens our fears and anxieties as we run through scenarios in our head. So these can be positive and negative things that we're constantly creating for ourselves and for others. But fundamentally, the Lord wants to be a part of all of that. He wants to be a part of our hopes and our fears. He wants to be a part of our creation. And ultimately, the idea is for our creation to reflect the Lord. So point 3 this morning is we're invited to bring God into our imaginations, into our lives, our free will, into what we're creating day after day. And are we living life like it's something to be endured and to get through? Or are we living life as the gift that it is and the powers that the Lord has granted us to really experience and get closer to Him? So if I could invite the worship team back. If you're like me, you can spend time when we talk on creation thinking, I don't draw or paint, I cannot make clothes like someone that I was with yesterday, I don't write songs, and you use the phrase, I am not creative. But like it or not, everything that we do creates in this world. It creates an impression on ourselves, it creates an impression on others. Our lives are a canvas that we're invited to create. And the way we live our lives each day is our ultimate creation. So the question is, how do I ensure that God is in my creation? Do we just share the desires of our hearts with the Lord? Do we ask Him to shape and mold these to align with His desires for us? And do our creations reflect the Lord? Do we allow ourselves to be inspired by the Lord's creation? Amen.